What happens when one of music's biggest stars walks onto a talk show, expecting a friendly conversation, and instead gets ambushed with accusations that question his entire career? Bruno Mars thought he was doing a routine appearance on The View to promote his latest album, but what started as small talk quickly spiraled into one of the most intense confrontations daytime television has ever seen. Before we get into this explosive exchange, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us whose side you're on, because trust me, you're going to have strong opinions about this one. So Bruno walks out to applause, gives his signature smile and wave to the audience, and takes his seat at the table. The hosts welcome him warmly, and for the first few minutes everything seems perfectly normal. Whoopi starts things off by congratulating him on the new album and asking about his creative process. Bruno talks about spending months in the studio, working with different producers, and how he wanted this album to have a more personal feel than his previous work. The audience is eating it up, and you can see Bruno is relaxed, leaning back in his chair, gesturing with his hands as he speaks. He's in his element, doing what he's done 100 times before on talk shows across the country. Then Joy Behar leans forward and the energy in the room shifts immediately. She starts by saying she has a question that she thinks a lot of people have been wondering about. Bruno nods, still smiling, clearly not sensing what's coming. Joy says, "So Bruno, your music has been incredibly successful, but there's been ongoing criticism about cultural appropriation. You're known for doing funk, soul, R&B, genres that were created by black artists. How do you respond to people who say you're profiting off of black culture?" You can literally see Bruno's face change. The smile doesn't disappear completely, but it definitely freezes. There's this moment of silence that feels like it lasts forever, even though it's probably only 2 or 3 seconds. The other hosts look uncomfortable. Sunny Hostin is looking down at her notes. Sarah Haynes is glancing between Joy and Bruno. Even Whoopi seems caught off guard by how directly Joy phrased the question. Bruno takes a breath, and you can tell he's choosing his words carefully. He says, "Well, Joy, I appreciate you asking me directly instead of just talking about it on social media like a lot of people do. I've addressed this before, but I'm always happy to talk about it again. I grew up in Hawaii in a Filipino and Puerto Rican family. Music was everything in my house. My dad had a band. I was performing since I was 4 years old. I didn't choose to love these genres because I thought they'd make me money. I loved them because that's what I grew up listening to. That's what moved me. That's what made me want to be a musician in the first place." Joy doesn't look satisfied with this answer. She interrupts him and says, "But don't you see how it's problematic? Black artists created these genres often out of struggle and oppression, and then artists who aren't black come in and get more success, more radio play, more opportunities. You have to acknowledge that dynamic." Bruno sits up straighter now, and his tone changes slightly. He's still polite, but there's an edge to his voice that wasn't there before. He says, "I absolutely acknowledge the history and the foundation that black artists created. I've said that in countless interviews. I've talked about my influences. James Brown, Prince, Michael Jackson. These are my heroes. But what am I supposed to do? Not make music? Not sing the way I sing? Not play the instruments I learned to play as a kid? I respect the culture. I honor it. I've never claimed to create something that wasn't already there. I'm paying homage, not stealing." Joy shakes her head and says, "But it's not just about intent, Bruno. It's about impact. The impact is that you're getting opportunities and making millions while black artists who sound like you, who created this sound, are still struggling to get recognition. Don't you feel any responsibility for that?" Now Bruno's jaw tightens and he says, "What exactly is my responsibility, Joy? Should I give back my Grammy Awards? Should I stop making music? I work incredibly hard at what I do. I didn't get handed anything. I was rejected by labels for years before anyone gave me a shot. I worked as a songwriter. I grinded. I paid my dues. So yeah, I made it, and I'm grateful for that, but I didn't take anything from anyone. There's room for all of us." Alyssa Farah Griffin tries to jump in to diffuse the tension. She says, "I think what Bruno is saying is that music is universal, and artists draw inspiration from what moves them." But Joy cuts her off and says, "No, let Bruno answer this. Bruno, do you think you would be as successful if you were a dark-skinned black man singing the exact same songs? Be honest. The studio audience is dead silent now. You could hear a pin drop. Bruno stares at Joy for a long moment and then he says, I don't know, Joy. Maybe not. But I also don't know if I'd be as successful if I was 6'5" and looked like a model. I don't know if I'd be as successful if I had been born in a different era. There are a million factors that go into success, and yeah, privilege is one of them. I'm not denying that, but you're sitting here acting like I chose to be born who I am. Like I strategized my entire existence to exploit black culture. That's not what happened. I'm just a musician who loves music. Joy leans back and crosses her arms. She says, I'm not saying you're a bad person, Bruno. I'm saying you benefit from a system that privileges non-black artists in genres that black people created. That's just a fact. And I think you should be more vocal about acknowledging that instead of getting defensive every time someone brings it up. Bruno laughs, but it's not a happy laugh. It's a laugh of disbelief. He says, I'm defensive. Joy, you basically just accused me of stealing my career. How else am I supposed to respond? And I have acknowledged it. I just did, right now. I acknowledge the privilege that exists in the music industry. But what more do you want from me? You want me to apologize for being successful? You want me to apologize for the music I make? Whoopi finally steps in and says, Okay, I think we all understand that this is a complicated issue with a lot of different perspectives. But Joy isn't done. She says, Bruno, all I'm saying is that your success doesn't exist in a vacuum. When you win awards and get opportunities, that's one less award and one less opportunity for a black artist. That's just math. And I think you need to sit with that reality instead of acting like you're being attacked. Bruno's face is red now and his voice gets louder. He says, acting like I'm being attacked? Joy, you literally invited me on this show under the pretense of promoting my album, and instead you're putting me on trial for the crime of making music. If you had these issues with me, why even invite me here? Why not just keep tweeting about it or writing articles about it like everyone else? Joy fires back immediately and says, We invited you because you're a public figure with a platform, and these are important conversations that need to be had. You don't get to just collect your accolades and ignore the legitimate criticisms people have about your work. Bruno shakes his head and says, Ignore? I've never ignored anything. I've spoken about this. I've given credit where credit is due. But you know what, Joy? There's a difference between having a conversation and being attacked. And right now it feels a lot more like an attack than a conversation. Sarah Haynes finally manages to get a word in and says, I think we can all agree that this is a sensitive topic and there are valid points on both sides. Maybe we can talk about how Bruno has supported other artists or collaborated with. But Joy interrupts her too and says, No, Sarah, we're not going to both sides this. This isn't a matter of opinion, it's about historical context and power dynamics. Bruno makes millions singing in styles that black artists pioneered and often don't get the same level of success for. That's not an opinion, that's a documented reality. Bruno leans forward now, his hands clasped together on the table and says, Joy, I have collaborated with black artists. I've written songs for black artists. I've worked with black producers and musicians my entire career. Some of my band members are black. I've never tried to erase anyone or pretend like I invented something I didn't. So I'm really struggling to understand what you want from me here. Do you want me to quit? Do you want me to only make music that you deem appropriate for my ethnicity? Because that sounds pretty problematic to me too. The audience gasps. You can hear some murmurs rippling through the crowd. Joy's eyes widen and she says, Don't you dare try to flip this around and make me the problem. I'm not the one appropriating culture. I'm asking you to take accountability. Bruno raises his voice and says, Accountability for what? For being a musician? For loving soul music? For being born Puerto Rican and Filipino instead of black? Tell me, Joy, what exactly should I be held accountable for? Sonny Hostin jumps in now and says, Bruno, I think what Joy is trying to say is that there's a larger conversation about representation in the music industry. It's not personal to you specifically, it's about a system. But Bruno cuts her off and says, Oh, it feels pretty personal, Sonny. When you invite someone on your show and spend the entire time questioning whether they deserve their success, that's personal. When you suggest that someone's career is built on theft, that's personal. Joy slams her hand on the table, not hard enough to be aggressive, but enough to make a point, and says, I never said theft. Don't put words in my mouth. I said appropriation, and yes, there's a difference, but that doesn't make it okay. You are taking from a culture that is not yours, and profiting from it in ways that people from that culture often cannot. That is what appropriation means. Bruno stands up now. He's not leaving yet, but he's clearly heated. He says, taking? Taking? I'm celebrating it. I'm honoring it. Every single time I step on stage, I'm paying tribute to the artists who came before me. I've said in interviews that without black music, there would be no Bruno Mars. I've said that publicly, repeatedly. Joy stands up too and says, saying it in interviews isn't enough, Bruno. What are you actually doing? Are you using your platform to advocate for black artists? Are you speaking out when they're overlooked? Are you sharing your opportunities? Or are you just collecting your checks and saying thanks for the inspiration when someone calls you out? Bruno's voice cracks slightly and he says, you don't know what I do. You don't know who I help or what conversations I have privately. You're sitting here making assumptions about my entire character based on what? The fact that I make soul music and I'm not black? That's not fair, Joy. Whoopi stands up now and says, okay, everybody needs to take a breath. This is getting heated, and I think we all need to, but Joy interrupts even Whoopi and says, no, Whoopi, I'm tired of tiptoeing around this. We have a responsibility on this show to ask tough questions and hold people accountable. Bruno looks at Whoopi and then back at Joy and says, accountable? You keep using that word like I committed some crime. I make music. That's it. I write songs. I perform. I try to put on the best show I can for people. If that's a crime, then I guess I'm guilty. Joy says, it's not about crime, it's about privilege and awareness. And honestly, Bruno, the fact that you're getting this defensive tells me everything I need to know. Bruno laughs bitterly and says, I'm defensive because you're attacking me, Joy. You've been attacking me since 5 minutes into this interview. And you know what the most frustrating part is? I came here excited. I came here thinking we were going to talk about music and the album, and maybe have some fun. Instead, I walked into an ambush. The audience is completely divided now. Some people are clapping for Bruno. Some people are clapping for Joy. And the other hosts look absolutely mortified. Joy sits back down and says, if you feel ambushed by a simple question about your place in the music industry, maybe that's something you need to examine within yourself. Bruno stays standing and says, a simple question. Joy, you've been interrogating me for 15 minutes about whether I deserve my career. That's not a simple question. That's an accusation disguised as a question. And honestly, I'm done pretending like this is a reasonable conversation. Alyssa tries again and says, maybe we can move on to talking about the actual album, the creative choices you made, the sound you were going for. Bruno looks at her, and you can see he's trying to calm down. He takes a breath and sits back down slowly. He says, yeah, I'd love to talk about the album. That's why I came here. Joy immediately says, but you can't just ignore uncomfortable truths, Bruno. The album exists in a cultural context, and that context matters. Bruno closes his eyes for a second like he's summoning every ounce of patience he has left and says, I'm not ignoring anything, Joy. But there's a time and a place for every conversation. If you wanted to have a debate about cultural appropriation, you should have told me that's what this interview was going to be. You should have been honest about your intentions instead of blindsiding me on live television. Joy scoffs and says, blindsiding you? This has been a topic of discussion around your music for years. You're a grown man. You had to know this might come up. Bruno says, of course I knew it might come up. But there's a difference between asking a question and prosecuting someone. You're not interested in my answer, Joy. You've already made up your mind about who I am and what I represent. Sonny interjects and says, Bruno, I don't think that's fair. Joy is asking tough questions, but that's what journalism is. Bruno turns to Sonny and says, journalism? This isn't journalism, Sonny. This is a gotcha moment. This is trying to make me look bad for ratings. The audience reacts loudly to that. Some people boo, some people cheer. Joy's face turns red and she says, excuse me? We don't need to manufacture drama for ratings, We have plenty of viewers who appreciate real conversations about real issues. Bruno says, real conversations require good faith from both sides, Joy. You haven't shown me any good faith since the moment you asked your first question. Everything I've said, you've twisted or dismissed. Whoopi raises her voice now, louder than before, and says, all right, that's enough. Both of you. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to reset this conversation. The producers are probably panicking right now, but they cut to commercial. When they come back, you can tell someone has talked to both Bruno and Joy during the break because they both look slightly more composed, but the tension is still thick. Whoopi starts by saying, okay, we're back, and I think we all got a little heated before the break. This is clearly a topic that people feel passionate about. Bruno, I want to give you a chance to say what you want to say without interruption. Bruno nods and says, thank you, Whoopi. Look, I understand why this conversation exists. I understand the history of black music and how black artists have been exploited and marginalized. I'm not denying any of that, but I also think it's possible to appreciate and participate in a genre without it being appropriation. Music is meant to be shared. It's meant to cross boundaries. My entire life is proof of that. I grew up in a multicultural household listening to everything from traditional Filipino music to James Brown to rock and roll. He continues, when I make music, I'm not thinking about what my ethnicity allows me to do. I'm thinking about what feels authentic to me, what feels true. And yes, I've been successful. And yes, I'm grateful for that success. But I've also worked my entire life for it. I've sacrificed relationships. I've sacrificed my health at times. I've poured everything I have into my craft. So when someone suggests that my success is illegitimate or unearned, it hurts. It really does. Because I know how hard I've worked. Joy waits until he's completely finished, and then says, and I hear all of that, Bruno. I do. But the point I'm trying to make is that hard work isn't the only factor in success. There are systemic advantages that some artists have over others, and I think it's important for artists who benefit from those advantages to acknowledge them and use their platform to lift up the voices that are often marginalized. Bruno nods slowly and says, I agree with that. I do try to use my platform responsibly. But I also think there's a limit to how much responsibility one person can take for an entire industry's problems. I can't fix systemic racism, Joy. I can't undo decades of exploitation. All I can do is be respectful, be honest, and make the best music I can. Joy says, but do you understand why some people look at your success and feel frustrated? Do you understand why a black artist might see you winning a Grammy for rhythm and blues and feel like the system is rigged? Bruno pauses and says, yeah, I do understand that. And it's complicated because I don't think the answer is for me to stop making music or to feel guilty about the music I make. But I also recognize that the playing field isn't level. I recognize that I've probably had doors opened for me that might not have been opened if I looked different. Sarah says, I think that's a really honest answer, Bruno. And I think this is the kind of nuanced conversation we need to be having about these issues. Joy says, I appreciate the honesty too, but I still think there needs to be more action behind the words. Bruno looks exhausted now and says, what action, Joy? Specifically, what do you want me to do? Joy says, speak up when black artists are overlooked. Use your industry connections to create opportunities. Donate to organizations that support black musicians. Bruno says, and what if I told you I already do some of those things? Would you believe me, or would you say I'm just trying to save face? Joy leans back and says, I would want to see proof. I would want to see consistent action over time, not just words in an interview when you're being criticized. Bruno runs his hand over his face and says, and that right there is the problem, Joy. Nothing I say is good enough for you. I could list every single thing I've ever done to support other artists and you'd still find a reason to say it's not enough. You've already decided I'm the villain in your story. Joy says, you're not the villain, Bruno. You're just someone who benefits from an unfair system and doesn't want to admit it. Bruno's voice rises again and he says, I literally just admitted it. 5 minutes ago I said I recognize the privilege I have. What more do you want? Joy says, I want you to stop acting like you're the victim here. You're a millionaire superstar. You're not the victim. Bruno stands up again and says, I never said I was a victim of anything except this interview. You've spent the last 30 minutes attacking my character and questioning my integrity. That's not about systemic racism, Joy. That's about you wanting to make a point at my expense. Whoopi puts her hand up and says, Bruno, I think you need to calm down. Bruno turns to her and says, with all due respect, Whoopi, I've been calm for most of this. I've tried to answer every question honestly, but at some point I have to stand up for myself. I'm not going to sit here and be told that my entire career is based on theft and appropriation. I'm just not going to do that. Sonny says, no one is saying your career is based on theft, Bruno. We're just examining the cultural dynamics at play. Bruno says, it sure feels like that's what's being said, Sonny. Joy says, maybe you feel that way because deep down you know there's truth to it. Bruno's jaw drops and he says, wow. Wow, Joy. So now you're psychoanalyzing me? You're telling me what I know deep down? You don't know me. You don't know what I think or feel or believe. You know my music, and you've decided that's enough to judge my entire character. Joy says, I'm judging your actions and your responses, Bruno. And your responses today have been defensive, dismissive, and frankly disappointing. Bruno picks up his microphone from the table, the one that was clipped to his shirt, and starts to unclip it. He says, you know what? I think we're done here. This clearly isn't going anywhere productive. Joy says, so you're just going to walk away? That's your solution? Bruno says, I came here to promote my album and have a conversation. I didn't come here to be lectured and vilified. So yeah, I'm going to walk away because this stopped being a conversation a long time ago. Whoopi stands up and says, Bruno, please sit down. We can finish this out. Bruno shakes his head and says, why? So Joy can ask me 10 more questions designed to make me look like a bad person? No thank you. I've had enough. Alyssa says, Bruno, we really do want to hear about your album. We want to end this on a positive note. Bruno looks at her and his expression softens slightly. He says, I appreciate that, Alyssa. I really do. But I think the damage is done here. Joy says, the only damage is your refusal to have an honest conversation about race and culture. Bruno turns back to her and says, I've been nothing but honest, Joy. Brutally honest. I've acknowledged privilege. I've acknowledged systemic inequality. I've talked about my influences and my respect for black culture. What I haven't done is apologize for existing, and I'm not going to start now. Joy says, no one is asking you to apologize for existing. Bruno says, then what are you asking, Joy? Because I genuinely don't know anymore. It feels like no matter what I say, it's wrong. Sarah finally says, I think what we're seeing here is how difficult these conversations can be. There's pain and frustration on all sides. Bruno says, you're right, Sarah. These conversations are difficult. But they're made even more difficult when one person comes in with an agenda and isn't actually interested in listening. Joy says, my agenda is justice and equity, Bruno. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe that's something you need to sit with. Bruno lets out a long breath and says, you know what, Joy? I hope you feel good about this. I hope you feel like you accomplished something today. Because from where I'm standing, all you've done is create more division and more anger. You haven't changed my mind. You haven't educated me on anything I didn't already know, and you definitely haven't made the world a better place. Congratulations. The audience is completely split, with some people applauding Bruno and others looking shocked at his outburst. Whoopi tries one more time and says, Bruno, please, let's just take another breath but Bruno is already walking off the set. He waves to the audience, and you can see some people standing and clapping while others are sitting with their arms crossed. Joy calls after him and says, running away doesn't solve anything, Bruno. He stops at the edge of the stage, turns around and says, neither does ambushing people on television, Joy. Maybe next time try having a real conversation instead of a public execution. Then he walks off completely. The camera shows the host sitting in stunned silence. Whoopi looks at the camera and says, well, that was certainly not how we expected this interview to go. We'll be right back after this break. The tension in that studio must have been absolutely suffocating. Joy sits there with her arms crossed, looking vindicated, while the other hosts look uncomfortable and unsure of what just happened. The audience is buzzing with conversations, and you can tell this is going to be talked about for weeks, if not months. What's your take on this whole situation? Did Joy cross the line with her questioning, or was she asking legitimate questions that needed to be asked? Did Bruno overreact, or was he justified in walking off? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe because we're going to be covering all the fallout from this interview. Who do you think was right in this confrontation?